1923. Rook County, a lean stretch of wind-scoured prairie in northern Colorado. Winter came early and hard that year, pressing frost into the windows of the old schoolhouse and breaking the will of every fence post too green to split. The land rolled flat and endless, a cold ocean of dry grass and buried stone. Smoke from scattered homesteads lifted in lonely trails and vanished before anyone could say if they were real. Joanna sat hunched on the front steps of the clapboard house her father built before the war. A shawl wrapped around her shoulders but didn't keep out the wind that sliced up from the hollow. Her knuckles were raw, her lips split from the night before. She had not slept. The silence of the prairie felt like mockery. It had always been silent out here, but now it was different. Now it seemed to watch her. The baby was crying again, and her boy, not yet 4, stood at the edge of the porch, holding one broken boot in his hand like he couldn't remember how it came off. His name was Thomas. Her daughter Mercy was still too small to know the difference between a storm and a calm day. Joanna didn't move. The world had kept turning without her permission, and all she could do was stay still. Just stay still a little longer. A week ago, Warren had taken the mare and the saddlebag and gone east toward Greeley. He said he would be back by Thursday with feed, maybe a doctor for the girl's cough. He had not returned. She'd heard that story from her own mother years ago, different man, same direction. The feed sack still hung empty on the nail, and the cough had turned thick and wet in the girl's chest. Joanna's hair was matted near her temple where she'd leaned against the doorframe through the night. She felt like something had snapped inside her ribs quietly, cleanly. A fracture, not a wound. Something nobody could see, but it changed how she breathed. Behind her, the kettle had boiled dry on the stove. She'd meant to make cornmeal, but found the bin scraped clean. The boy was hungry and didn't know not to say so out loud. She stared out across the field. Last year's corn stubble stood in brittle rows, the soil gone dusty and pale from too much sun and not enough rain. They had never had much, but they had made it work with a little help and a lot of pretending. Now there was no pretending left. There was only this morning and the weight of it pressing down on her. A crow landed on the fence post, black against the white sky. Its caw was sharp like laughter from someone who'd never had to work the land. She stood. Her legs ached from crouching too long, and her left boot was torn at the heel. She picked up Mercy with one arm and took the boy's hand with the other. The cold bit her knuckles, but she walked them inside anyway because there was still firewood under the cot, and because she had to. She was their mother. There was no one else. The door creaked shut behind them, muffling the wind, but not the silence. That afternoon the snow began to fall. Not thick or hurried, just a slow drifting that settled into the wind like it belonged there. Joanna watched it through the cracked window pane while Mercy slept across her lap and Thomas played with 2 smooth stones he called his horses. He'd scratched eyes onto them with a coal nub and sometimes spoke softly to them like they could hear. The room smelled of smoke and wet cloth. The last of the firewood was stacked in a crooked pile by the stove. She hadn't dared go to the shed. Too many rumors about coyotes coming in close this winter, and she didn't trust her footing on the ice. She couldn't afford a sprained ankle, not now. The snow softened everything, even the sharp angles of the old stove, and for a moment the house felt like it could almost be gentle. Joanna's thoughts wandered where she didn't want them to the kitchen wall where Warren's coat had hung, to the time before Mercy was born when Thomas still cried for her in the night and Warren would lift him with one arm and lay him on his chest, both of them asleep before the kettle sang. She hadn't asked for tenderness, but when it came, it had felt like a mercy too big to keep. That Warren was not the man who left. Or maybe he had always been both and she just hadn't seen it. She traced a finger over Mercy's cheek, cool and damp. The child stirred but did not wake. Joanna leaned back into the chair and let her eyes close for a moment, not to sleep, just to rest the world. A knock at the door broke the quiet. She opened her eyes. Thomas froze in the corner, his horses dropped. It came again, not loud but firm. Joanna stood, heart hammering in her throat. She set Mercy down in the cot and reached for the iron poker. The last time someone knocked out here, it was a man asking for something he had no right to. She unlatched the door and pulled it open just wide enough to see. He stood a step back from the threshold, hat in hand, snow in his beard. He looked too clean to be a local, but his boots were worn to the sole. A pack hung over one shoulder and his coat was patched in 3 places. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dry but respectful, "you got a fire going. I wondered if I might warm myself a spell." Joanna didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the road, empty in both directions. She knew better than to trust strangers, especially ones who showed up uninvited. But the wind was biting and his fingers were red to the knuckle. He didn't look like he was pretending to be cold. He didn't look like he'd eaten much either. She let the door open wider and stepped back. 5 minutes. Then you move on. He nodded once, stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "Yes, ma'am." The warmth hit him all at once. He didn't speak again, just crouched near the stove and rubbed his hands together, face tilted toward the weak flame. Joanna watched every movement, the poker still resting against her thigh. Thomas peered around the chair. The stranger gave him a soft nod, then glanced at the cot where Mercy had begun to stir. "You're alone out here?" he asked low. Joanna said nothing. He nodded again like he didn't expect an answer. "Name's Eli." She didn't give hers. The room filled with the crackle of the fire and the quiet shuffle of a man trying not to overstay his welcome. He didn't ask for food, didn't ask where the man of the house was. Just sat and warmed his hands and watched the snow fall through the same cracked glass. After a while he stood. "Thank you," he said. "That's enough warmth for now." Joanna didn't reply. She was watching him too closely, waiting for the catch. He paused at the door, hand on the latch. Then, without turning, he added, "If you got a sick child, there's a woman down by Owl Creek knows her way with herbs. Old but sharp. I can point the way." He stepped out before she could answer. She closed the door behind him, hands trembling not from fear but something else. Something like the edge of remembering what it felt like when someone offered something without asking first. She stood there long after he was gone, staring at the empty road. Subscribe and let the frontier unfold slowly. He didn't return the next day or the one after. Joanna tried not to look for him, but her eyes went to the road each time she stepped outside to shake out a rug or check for tracks. The snow had crusted over with ice, and the wind had shifted west, rattling the boards of the chicken coop and whistling under the eaves like it meant to get in. Mercy's cough had settled into something deeper. Her chest wheezed when she lay flat, and at night her small body curled tight like she could fold away the sickness if she tried hard enough. Joanna chewed pine bark for the bitterness and boiled it into water, but it didn't do much. She wrapped the girl in all the quilts and rubbed her chest with bear grease. Still the child's eyes stayed dull, and her hands too cold. On the 4th day she strapped Mercy to her chest and took Thomas by the hand. She didn't leave a note. There was no one to read it. The trail to Owl Creek was not easy. The wagon road was buried in snow, and the wind scoured her face raw within the first hour. She wore Warren's old coat, stiff with disuse, and shoved her hands into the pockets to find an old tobacco pouch and a pair of flattened nails. She kept walking. Thomas didn't complain. He knew better. He was hungry again, but he didn't say that either. By mid-afternoon the sun broke through the clouds just long enough to show the ravine below. Owl Creek. A smudge of smoke marked one end. Joanna adjusted Mercy on her hip and picked her way down the narrow path, boots sliding on the packed snow. The house was small, built from thick timber with moss in the chinks. Smoke curled from a pipe in the roof. She knocked with her knuckles sharp and fast, ready to turn if it was the wrong door. It wasn't. A woman opened it. older than Joanna by decades, with skin like tanned hide and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She looked Joanna up and down, then bent and looked at the child. "Bring her in," she said, stepping aside. The room was dim but warm. It smelled of pine pitch smoke and dried sage. The woman took Mercy from Joanna's arms without asking and pressed her ear to the girl's chest. She muttered something in a language Joanna didn't know, then set to work. Joanna didn't ask questions. She just sat on the floor back against the wall and pulled Thomas into her lap. He leaned his head against her chest and closed his eyes. The woman worked with quiet confidence, boiling water, mixing powders, smearing ointments on Mercy's chest and feet. At one point she glanced at Joanna. "She's not gone under yet," the woman said. "But you were near out of time." Joanna nodded once. Her throat ached, but no sound came. "Man who sent you, he said there were little ones," the woman added. "I don't take visitors unless I know who's hurting." Joanna blinked. "You mean Eli?" The woman gave a half nod. "Rides light. Doesn't ask much. Helped patch my roof last fall when a cougar took my goat." Joanna didn't say what she was thinking. That she hadn't expected him to remember her. That she didn't know why it mattered. They stayed the night. The woman laid down a pallet for Joanna and Thomas and tucked Mercy in close to the stove. In the dark, with only the sound of her daughter breathing and Thomas's small hand curled in her own, Joanna let herself cry. Just a little. Just enough. In the morning, Mercy's fever had broken. She looked up at her mother and smiled the first time in days. Joanna gathered her children and thanked the woman with all the words she had. As she stepped out into the cold wind, catching her shawl, she saw him. Eli stood near the edge of the woods, tying down a bundle to the back of a mule. He turned when she approached, gave a nod like he'd been expecting her. "You found it," he said simply. "I did." He looked at the child in her arms, then at Thomas, who stared back solemnly. "You going back?" he asked. Joanna hesitated. "There's not much to go back to." He nodded. "Still yours, though." She didn't respond right away. The snow crunched under her boots as she shifted Mercy on her hip. Then, without thinking, she asked, "Where are you headed?" He looked out over the rise. "Nowhere in particular. Just away from where I was." She knew what that meant. Then, surprising herself, she said, "We got a roof. Leaks some stoves mean. But if you're passing back that way, we could use help with the well." He met her eyes, slow and steady. "I might pass through." And that was all they said. She turned and started up the trail with her children, her body aching but something else inside her settling quiet. Behind her, Ellie finished tying the mule and watched until she disappeared into the trees. The well froze 2 weeks later. Joanna stood over it at dawn with the sun barely a smear of light behind the ridge, staring down at the black mouth where the rope hung stiff. The crank wouldn't budge. She tried pouring hot water along the rim, beating at the edge with a hammer, even prayed once quietly, not expecting an answer. Nothing worked. That night she rationed what they had filled tin cups with melted snow and told Thomas it was a special kind of winter tea. He didn't believe her, but he drank it anyway. She wasn't sure why she expected Ellie to come back. She hadn't asked, not really. She'd made a passing offer, and he hadn't promised a thing. Men like that didn't. They came and went with the season or the weather, whichever was stronger. Still, when she stepped out to split kindling on the 3rd day of hauling snow by hand, she saw tracks in the frost. Mule prints. One man's boots. He stood at the edge of the field near the old chicken fence, arms crossed, watching the house, like he didn't want to spook it. When she raised her hand, he raised his. Slow and careful, like that was the kind of thing a person could break if they did it wrong. Eli didn't come inside right away. He helped her with the well first, dug out the crusted snow, poured coals down the shaft, and rigged a new cover with a tarp and some board. When water finally rose again cold and clean, Joanna dipped her hands into it and let the chill numb her fingers. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. By the time she invited him in, night had fallen. She warmed a pan of beans over the fire and split the last apple 3 ways. They didn't talk much. Thomas curled up with his stones. Mercy slept. Eli sat on a stump near the stove, quiet as smoke. Later, while she mended a tear in Thomas's coat, he asked without looking up, "You always been out here alone?" She didn't answer. He tried again. "You've done right by them. Lot of folks wouldn't." Joanna glanced up. "That's supposed to make it easier." "No," he said, after a pause. "Just truer." That night he slept in the shed, didn't ask for a blanket, didn't linger near the door like he wanted in. He just nodded when she told him where he could stay and didn't speak again. For a week he didn't leave. He hauled wood without being asked, repaired the co-op roof, and taught Thomas how to lay a straight line in the snow. They didn't talk about the past or why he was there. Joanna didn't press. She didn't want promises. She just needed another pair of hands, and for now he gave them. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when the children were asleep and the world held still, when something passed between them. Not words, not touches, just something old and gentle. The way he poured water slow so it wouldn't splash. The way he looked at Mercy like he'd never seen anything so small survive so much. One night while she sat by the fire sewing a button, she asked him what he'd done before this. He rubbed a thumb over the rim of his mug. Rode fence. Cattle mostly. Fought in the war. Drank too much after. Lost some things. What things? Too many to name, he said. Then, after a long pause, one of 'em was a daughter. Joanna felt something drop in her chest, soft but deep. She didn't speak, just reached for another button and kept sewing. He stood a while later and said good night. Before he stepped out, he turned back. "I ain't trying to take anything from you," he said. She met his eyes. "I know." He nodded once and was gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and dusting the windows with snow. Inside, the stove glowed steady. The boy slept, the girl breathed even. And Joanna sat there in the quiet, unsure if what she felt was sorrow or its softer cousin. Spring came slow to Rook County, seeping in with gray skies and thawed mud. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing bent fence posts, broken branches, and the bones of animals that hadn't made it through. Joanna dug with her bare hands in the garden bed, turning over the hard, wet soil and finding worms in the thaw. Life somehow still beneath the surface. Eli stayed. Not every night in the house. He kept to the shed or the barn, polite in a way that made her more aware of him than if he'd tried something else. He worked like he owed the land a debt, but never said what for. The children had taken to him. Thomas followed him through chores, learning how to oil hinges and wrap rope. Mercy called him Lie in her small, wet voice, and he let her ride his shoulders like she weighed nothing at all. Some days they didn't speak much. Other days they did. She learned he was from south of San Angelo, that his mother died when he was 12, and that he hadn't spoken to his brother in over 15 years. He learned that Joanna had never lived farther than a day's ride from this house, that her mother had died in childbirth with a 4th baby, and that she'd once wanted to be a school teacher before everything else got in the way. He told her about the war in fragments. Not the battles, just the silences afterward. "I'd hear birds again," he said once, "after the noise. Always thought it meant I was still alive." She didn't ask for more. Her silences had their own sound. As spring ripened, so did something between them. Not fast, not loud, just there. The way he'd touch the brim of his hat when she caught him looking at her across the field. The way she'd leave a second mug out without asking. The way Mercy reached for his hand now when she was scared and he let her. But quiet affection doesn't shield you from the rest of the world. One warm morning, just before sunrise, a wagon came up the road. Joanna saw it from the porch, coffee and hand hair still wet from washing. Two men rode up front, both wearing deputy stars, neither one smiling. The second man had a thick jaw and pale eyes, and he kept his hand near his hip. Joanna didn't move. Thomas watched from the window. "Ma'am," the taller one said, "we're looking for a man named Elijah Harrow. Rode through Owl Creek some weeks back. You seen him?" She didn't answer. The man continued. "He's wanted in Dawson County. Desertion, theft, and obstruction. Not a bounty, just an arrest. But we'd be obliged if you pointed us the right way." Joanna stared at him. She thought of Mercy asleep in the corner with her thumb in her mouth, of Thomas always watching, of Ellie fixing the barn roof with a limp he tried to hide, of the way he never asked for anything except to stay busy. She tilted her chin. Never heard that name. The taller man squinted. The other one narrowed his eyes like he could see the truth sitting in her throat. "Well," the tall one said, "if you do hear anything, you best write to Sheriff Bolton. We'd hate to find out you were sheltering someone under false name. Could be trouble for you and your little ones." She didn't flinch, just nodded once and watched them turn the wagon around. They left a track of wet ruts in the road, and dust hung in the air long after they were gone. Ely came back that evening with a brace of rabbits and a cut on his cheek. She didn't ask how he got it. "They came," she said. "He didn't ask who. He just looked at her and waited. I told them I didn't know you." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't." "I did anyway." He set the rabbits down. "You know what I am now." She stepped closer. "I knew before." He looked like he might say something more. Instead, he took off his hat and held it at his side. "I don't want to bring harm to your door," he said. "You already did," she said, voice low. "And it wasn't the kind that breaks things." For a long time, neither of them moved. That night, he slept in the house. Not in her bed. Not even in the same room. But under the same roof, near enough to hear the same wind move across the floorboards. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. The days after felt different. The air still carried the scent of damp soil and chimney smoke, and Mercy still woke twice before dawn, needing to be held. But something had shifted in the house, like the walls knew now they were holding more than just a family and a secret. Ely didn't speak of the deputies again. He kept to the chores, taught Thomas how to set rabbit snares without catching his own hand, and fixed the fence around the western field, even though the soil was too poor to grow much. He moved like a man who didn't expect to stay, even though he hadn't said he was leaving. Joanna tried not to notice that. She tried not to notice the way he lingered by the porch after supper, boots planted in the soft dirt, eyes watching the sky like he was waiting for something. Or someone. She started baking again. Not much, just cornbread and hard biscuits, but enough to make the kitchen smell like it used to back when her father was alive and her mother hummed over the stove. She caught herself humming once too, and it startled her enough to stop. One morning while she was folding laundry, she found one of Warren's shirts missing from the pile she'd left by the hearth. She walked out back and saw Eli wearing its sleeves rolled, chopping wood. He looked up, saw her watching, and gave a small shrug. It was hanging there. Figured it was free game. Joanna looked away. It was. She didn't tell him that Warren used to wear that same shirt when he was in a good mood. That the threadbare collar had frayed from how many times she'd mended it. That she almost burned it last winter just to be done with it. Now, seeing it on Eli, she didn't want to. But peace, she knew, never stayed long without a price. It was near the end of April when a wagon pulled up the road again, this time not lawmen, but someone far worse. Rebecca Lantry. Joanna saw her from the far field, all lace gloves and high chin, sitting beside her brother in a fresh pressed suit. The Lantrys had money, land, and just enough cruelty to make both dangerous. Years ago, Joanna had gone to school with Rebecca back when skirts were shorter and names meant less, but that had changed. Rebecca had married into cattle, stayed near Denver, and never stopped looking at Joanna like she was one bad decision away from ruin. "Joe," she said, sweetly stepping down from the wagon, "I heard your man ran off. Figured you might need a little support." Joanna didn't offer her hand. "I don't need anything from you." Rebecca made a show of looking at the house, the half-mended fence, the sagging shed. "I think you do." Joanna crossed her arms. "Why are you really here?" Rebecca smiled. "We're buying land. Your section's the last piece between my brother's grazing lease and the river trail. You sell, we pay good. You don't, well, fences break. Livestock wanders." It wasn't a threat. Not directly. But Joanna knew what it meant. She didn't answer. Just turned her back and walked toward the porch, knowing they'd follow. Eli came around the side of the house just then, sleeves rolled, hands still stained with ash. Rebecca's face changed the second she saw him. She looked at Joanna, then at him, and smiled in that way that never meant anything good. "Well, now," she said, "that explains why you're still out here." Eli didn't flinch. Joanna stood still. "You need to go." Rebecca stepped closer. "You're sheltering a fugitive. You think that's not gonna catch up to you?" "You don't know anything." Rebecca leaned in. "I know you're alone. Always have been. And he's not gonna save you from what's coming." Joanna held her ground. Rebecca turned on her heel and climbed back into the wagon. As the wheels rolled away, dust rose behind them like a warning. That evening, Joanna stood by the window with her arms around her children. She watched Eli sit on the porch with his head bowed, sharpening the same knife over and over. She wanted to tell him he could stay, that she didn't care what name he'd worn before, that this place, her place, felt less like dying now that he was in it. But all she said was, "You should come inside." He did. And the night passed with the wind pressed low against the door as if waiting. The first fire came 2 nights later, a slow burn at the edge of the pasture, far enough that no animals were hurt, close enough to send a message. Eli saw it first, woke Joanna with a hand on her shoulder and no panic in his voice, just urgency. She threw on boots, bundled the children in blankets, and stood with them in the yard while Eli ran to dig a trench. The flames clawed at the fence line, orange against the black. He moved fast, shoveling dirt, beating sparks with an old wet sack until the glow gave out and the fire died choking in the soil. By dawn, the pasture smoked and stank. Thomas wouldn't let go of her leg. Mercy wouldn't stop coughing. Eli wiped his face with the sleeve of Warren's old shirt and didn't say a word. Joanna already knew who did it. But naming a thing didn't make it easier to kill. Later that morning, she found Eli packing his satchel. No words, just movement. The way men move when they've already made up their mind. She stood in the doorway and waited. "I'll draw more trouble if I stay," he said, finally, not looking at her. "They already came," she answered. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and turned to face her. "I won't be the reason your children get burned out." "They won't." "Whoa. You don't know that." She stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. "I know what it's like to be abandoned. Don't make me live through it again." That stopped him. She kept going. "You think running will make it right? That's what men like Warren believe too? But it doesn't fix anything. It just leaves the rest of us standing in a burned field with no water and 2 children who keep asking why." His shoulders dropped just a little. She saw the weight of it hit him then, not just the guilt, but the memory of what it had felt like to lose before. "I can't give you peace," he said. "I don't know if I've ever had any." Joanna nodded. "I'm not asking for peace. I'm asking you to fight." He looked up, eyes meeting hers, and in them she saw what she hadn't dared to name before. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something stronger than silence. That evening they went into town together. She wore her father's old coat and walked with her head high. Eli stayed half a step behind, watchful. At the general store she asked to see the sheriff. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Sheriff Bolton came out of the back, boots slow on the floorboards. He was an old man, tired in the bones, with a voice like gravel. "You bringin' a confession, Joanna?" "I'm bringing a truth," she said. "You know the Lantrys started that fire?" He raised an eyebrow. "I know what I can prove. I have witnesses she lied, and I'll find more. Unless you'd rather I go to the paper in Greeley and let them ask why you're protecting cattle barons while single mothers get burned off their land." His jaw tensed. Beside her, Eli said nothing. The sheriff looked between them, then nodded slow. "You make a statement. I'll see what I can do." That night they returned to the house, empty-handed but not beaten. They stood outside as the stars pushed through the black. Joanna lit a lantern and hung it by the door. It glowed warm in the wind. Eli touched her hand. Not by accident. Not lightly. Just enough to let her know he was still here. And for the first time since Warren left, she believed she wouldn't have to do this all alone. The sheriff didn't ride out the next day, nor the one after that. Justice, Joanna had long understood, was a thing men in power pretended to want but never wanted to pay for. Still, word spread. 2 hands from a neighboring farm came by with sacks of flour, and a half-joked warning heard Lantrys feeling cornered. That's when coyotes bite. Joanna thanked them then, stayed up that night with Eli, taking turns walking the fence line with a lantern. Neither said much. They didn't need to. It was enough that he was there. The days warmed. Mercy's cough finally broke. Thomas asked Eli to show him how to whittle, and Joanna caught herself smiling at nothing while pulling laundry from the line. The weight hadn't lifted, not completely, but it had shifted, settled into something she could carry. That calm cracked 2 weeks later, just after sunrise. Joanna heard the dogs first, barking wild and sharp from the barn. By the time she flung open the door, Eli was already outside, shirtless, holding a rifle, and staring down the 3 men on horseback just past the creek. Lantry's brother rode in the middle, hat low, jacket too clean. His hands weren't on his gun, but they weren't far. "You're trespassing," Eli said. The man smiled. "Just out for a morning ride. Saw smoke. Thought we'd stop in." Joanna stepped up beside Eli. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't have to. "You rode 4 miles off trail to look at smoke," she said flat. The man's smile didn't fade. "Funny you standing so close to him. Folks might start thinking you two are more than neighbors." "Let them," she said. One of the other riders spat. "He's wanted. You're harboring a fugitive." Eli didn't move. "You want to drag me into it proper? Not with 3 men and a lie." Lantry's brother tapped his reins. "We're not here to drag anybody. Just to make sure you know your place." "Think we do," Joanna said. "Right here, on land that ain't yours." The man's jaw twitched. He looked past her at the house, the field, the thin trail of chimney smoke. "Wouldn't want anything else catching fire," he said softly. Then he turned his horse and rode off. The others followed. No shots. No names. Just a promise left behind in the dirt. Eli lowered the rifle. Joanna exhaled slow. Later that day, Eli built a barricade across the lower trail and wired tin cans to the fence line. Joanna dug out her father's old pistol from a box under the floorboards and cleaned it with steady hands. They didn't talk about what came next. They just prepared. That night, after the children were asleep and the lantern burned low, Eli stepped close to her in the kitchen. His hands were rough, his eyes clear. "You still want me here?" he asked. She didn't answer with words, just nodded once and leaned into him. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. Just a stillness between them that felt like a vow. When he pulled back, he held her hand in both of his. She could feel the scar along his thumb. He'd never told her how he got it. She didn't need to know. "I won't run again," he said. "Good," she whispered, "because I can't hold this alone." She felt the truth of that settle into the air like heat from a fire, real, quiet, and steady. Outside, the wind moved through the grass and the land held still beneath the stars. The attack never came. Not in the way they expected, with fire or bullets or threats shouted from horseback. Instead, a deputy rode out a week later with dust on his coat and a sealed letter in hand. Sheriff Bolton had opened an inquiry into the Lantrys. The paper in Greeley had picked up the scent after all, and someone, maybe the clerk, maybe a farmhand tired of being ordered around, had leaked details. Suddenly the law wasn't so quiet. Suddenly the Lantrys had business elsewhere. The deputy barely looked at Eli when he handed over the letter. "Not my concern," he muttered, then turned and left the way he came. Joanna read the words twice, lips pressed thin. Then she handed it to Eli. Official-sounding language, but the meaning was simple. The charges had been dropped. The war was over. He could stop running. Eli folded the letter and slid it into his coat without a word. That night they sat on the porch while the children slept. The moon was nearly full. The garden, stubborn and crooked, had started to show green shoots. Mercy had learned how to laugh again. Thomas didn't flinch at footsteps in the yard. Joanna leaned her head on Eli's shoulder, the soft part just below the collarbone. He didn't move away. "You could go now," she said quiet. "I could," he said. "You won't." He turned to her then, slow and deliberate, and reached into his pocket. Not for a ring. Not yet. But he handed her a small carved horse, one of the stones Thomas had once played with, now worn, smooth, and shaped into something gentle. "For the girl," he said. "So she knows someone stayed." Joanna took it. Her fingers closed around it like it meant something, because it did. A month later they cleared the back room together, took down Warren's coat, opened the windows wide. They built a new fence that spring, a sturdier one, with cedar posts and wire that hummed in the wind. Neighbors helped, some with tools, some with nothing more than bread and quiet hands. By summer, Eli had moved inside for good. He fixed the barn roof and taught Mercy how to hold a hammer. Joanna planted onions. Thomas started saying "our place" instead of "the house." There were still long nights, still worries. But they were different now, shared. And when the wind came across the field in the early morning, it didn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounded like a life being built, one step at a time. If the fire warmed you, subscribe and stay near.